Hello, everyone, and welcome to the lecture on Aleksandr Aleksandrovich Blok, one of the most important and influential symbolist writers. Blok was from an upper-class academic family with an aristocratic background. His father was a professor at the University of Warsaw, but he was estranged from his father for most of his life. His mother was also the daughter of a professor and from an academic intellectual family, but they divorced. His parents divorced when he was very young, and he grew up largely estranged from his biological father, raised by his mother and his stepfather, who was an officer in the Life Guards. The Life Guards were a kind of guard in the military. Blok spent a lot of time as a young man in an estate that neighbored the estate of Dmitry Mendeleev, the chemist whom you probably know as creating the Mendeleev table of chemistry that everyone gets to memorize. Blok fell in love with his daughter, with Mendeleev's daughter, Lyubov Dmitrievna. And after a couple of years of courtship, in which Blok would walk from his estate to her estate, and they would meet at dawn and have various romantic encounters like that, they married in 1903. Unfortunately, the marriage was very difficult for both of them, and they were both made very unhappy by each other's behavior. Blok idolized Lyubov Dmitrievna and considered her to be the earthly embodiment of Sophia, the feminine aspect of divine wisdom, which, as you can imagine, made the marriage somewhat difficult. Both of them had affairs. They both struggled a lot with their marriage, and this turned into often a very unhappy source of inspiration, but nonetheless a major source of inspiration for Blok's poetry. And you can see the course of their marriage appear in the course of his poetry. Lyubov Dmitrievna herself was also an artist. She was an actress, and she acted sometimes unwillingly as a muse for both Blok and his fellow symbolist Andrei Biely, whom I mentioned in the lecture on symbolism. Biely also considered Lyubov Dmitrievna to be the earthly embodiment of Sophia, and again, this caused problems because Biely idolized her and wanted to have an affair with her. As I mentioned, Lyubov Dmitrievna served as one of Blok's major muses, or probably the major muse of his life. And his first serious poetry collection was Poems About a Beautiful Lady, or Verses About a Beautiful Lady. The original is Stikhi o Prekrasnoi Damye, which he wrote in 1901 and 1902 during his courtship of Lyubov Dmitrievna. And as you can guess, it was all about meetings with a beautiful lady. So, as I mentioned in the previous slide, Blok would have trysts with Lyubov Dmitrievna. He would walk across the fields to go meet with her and wait for her at various places on the border between their estates. Another feature that appears frequently in Stikhi o Prekrasnoi Damye is the bright red sunset and sunrise. This may have been because of the eruption of Mount Pelée in 1902, which caused ash to spread around the world and caused the sunrises and sunsets to be particularly bright and vivid at the time. And so part of the sort of mood of the piece is the lyrical hero going out to meet his beautiful lady against this backdrop of these almost eerily red glowing sunsets and sunrises. Stikhi o Prekrasnoi Damye made Blok a famous poet. It sort of created his career, and it also heralded this second-generation symbolism. So if you remember, first-generation symbolism was brought in by Brюсов, Merezhkovsky, and Hippius were the major actors for that generation. And then Blok and Biely were some of the major actors of second-generation symbolism, which appeared about 10 years later. And so Stikhi o Prekrasnoi Damye was the most important early work of second-generation symbolism and the one that really made symbolism the major form or major dominant movement in Russian literature at the time. In Stikhi o Prekrasnoi Damye, the muse, the beautiful lady, the person to whom all of the poems are dedicated, is somewhat threatening but elevated and idolized. She might be frightening to the lyrical eye, to the lyrical hero, but she is nonetheless considered to be good and above him. However, as Blok's relationship with Lyubov Dmitrievna went through difficult patches, that was reflected in his writing, most clearly in his turn to drama, and particularly Balaganchik, his first play. So after creating this major work of symbolist poetry, verse in Stikhi o Prekrasnai Damye, Blok wrote Balaganchik, or The Puppet Show, in 1906. And one of the major inspirations for it was this love triangle formed between him, Andrei Biely, and Lyubov Dmitrievna. The play is symbolist. It's full of mysticism. Characters are symbols, and it's full of these sort of supernatural events where everything is more meaningful than it seems on the surface. And it's basically about a love triangle between the Commedia dell'arte characters Pierrot, Colombina, and Harlequin. In it, Pierrot is almost certainly Blok. Pierrot, if you remember, is the sad clown in Commedia dell'arte. Harlequin is kind of the happy-go-lucky, jolly clown, and Colombina Columbine is the pert, pretty maid that both characters are in love with. And in Balaganchik, Pierrot and Harlequin are both in love with Colombina. Colombina leaves Pierrot for Harlequin, and she ends up being stabbed to death and revealed as a quote-unquote cardboard bride, kartodnaya nevyasta. And it ends with both Pierrot and Harlequin losing Colombina, and Pierrot finishing the play with a sad monologue. Balaganchik marked a turn in Blok's work from the elevation of the beautiful lady and the worship of the cult of Sophia to this theme of betrayal and revenge. And so in his later poems, his beautiful lady became a puppet, Colombina, and a cardboard bride, and a streetwalker, and is revealed to be, at best, just an ordinary human, and at worst, a degraded figure who betrays the hero. The hero also becomes a degraded figure who lets down those around him. Blok was also obsessed with the idea of himself, or his lyrical hero, as a fallen figure who had reached for something elevated, for something spiritual, for something beyond the ordinary realm of human experience, for something eternal, and had failed and had fallen into alcoholism, promiscuity, possibly sexually transmitted diseases. It's possible that Blok had syphilis. This rumor has gone around for a while. And this concept of the fallen hero and the fallen heroine is something that appears in much of Blok's later works. This theme of revenge or retribution expanded to include his whole family, basically. And in 1910 and 1911, he began work on an epic poem called Retribution or Возмездие, which was an epic cycle basically about his father and then himself, and then the possibility of a son whom he never had, or he Blok may have had an illegitimate son. Lyubov Dmitrievna did give birth to a child that was probably not Blok's biological child, and then tragically the child died, something that severely affected both Blok and Lyubov Dmitrievna. In any case, Blok wrote this poem, this epic poem, Возмездие, which is kind of about his father and himself, or a father and a son and a grandson, and these cycles of the generations and how problems and sin and tragedy pass down from generation to generation. And so Blok became more and more kind of caught up in this idea of revenge and degradation as his work progressed. Blok saw himself and his family and the upper classes as being caught up in this cycle of degradation and something that was probably going to be wiped out in the New World, but he saw the revolutions of 1905 and 1917 as these amazing cleansing events that would regenerate the world and bring about something new. And he greeted both the 1905 and 1917 revolutions with enthusiasm, wrote a number of political poems about them, and worked actively for the Soviet government. So the Soviet government was very interested in art, and as an important part of their overall campaign, they recruited a number of artists to work for them, to run committees, to encourage others to create art, and Blok was very active amongst these committees. Tragically, this may have led ultimately to his death, which happened in 1921. He was pressed into working so much for the Soviet government that his health began to fail, and he eventually died of inflammation of the heart, which may or may not have been related to the syphilis that he may or may not have had. As well as working for the Soviet government, he also wrote a number of revolutionary themed and political poems, and his most famous is 12, or the 12. It's another long epic poem about 12 Bolshevik soldiers who are walking through a snowstorm in winter, and it compares them eventually to the 12 apostles and shows them as being led by Jesus. In the final stanza, it shows them as walking through the snow and having Jesus floating above the snow leading them. And so it starts off with them as these very kind of profane characters who kind of go around swearing and picking fights with people and generally acting coarse, low class. One of them kills his fiancée for betraying him. It's again this theme of the beautiful woman who betrays you, Sophia who lets you down, who must then be destroyed. And so they go through Petrograd or Petersburg, basically harassing people and attacking people. And then at the end, it shows them as being led by Jesus. And so they seem to be serving this higher purpose even without knowing it. And Blok kind of saw the revolution as something that was violent and dangerous and in many ways bad, but ultimately serving a higher cause and something that he was happy to serve too. And like I said, unfortunately, his dedication to the cause and the Soviet government's happiness to work him to death ultimately is what probably led to his untimely death in 1921. Nonetheless, he remains one of the most important figures in Russian literature in the 20th century. Because of him, symbolism became probably the most important and most popular literary movement in the early 20th century. He was instrumental in popularizing poetry and supporting literature and the arts. He was also extremely influential on later poets such as Marina Tsvetaeva, who came a few years after him and continued to innovate and make the early 20th century one of the most interesting and exciting and important periods in Russian literature and Russian poetry specifically. And it's largely because of Blok that the Silver Age is the Silver Age.